she laughed and said, "Relax, Daniel, he's just staying for the night." Like I was some guest in my own house, like the last 10 years meant nothing, and for a second, I just stood there in the hallway, keys still in my hand, listening to the sound of her voice echo off the walls I paid for, the same walls that used to feel like home but now felt like a stage I didn't recognize anymore. And the strange part wasn't the betrayal, not really, it was how casual she made it sound, how normal she wanted it to feel, like bringing another man into our living room was just another Tuesday night decision, like I should nod, smile, and disappear quietly. And maybe the old version of me would have done exactly that. Maybe the man I used to be would have swallowed it, gone for a drive, convinced himself it was a phase, a misunderstanding, something he could fix if he just tried harder. But that version of me had been gone for weeks. Ever since the first cracks showed up in places she thought I'd never look, ever since the late nights stopped making sense and the phone started living face down like it had secrets it couldn't risk showing me. Ever since I realized that what we had wasn't just breaking, it had already been replaced by something toxic, something colder, something built on a dirty secret she thought she could control, and standing there in that moment, hearing her laugh with him like I wasn't even a factor anymore. I almost admired the confidence it took to cross that line so completely, because she really believed I was blind, she really believed I was still playing catch-up in a story she'd already rewritten. And that's when I set my keys down slowly on the counter, not because I was shocked, but because everything was finally happening exactly the way I planned it, every step, every detail, every quiet move I made in the background while she was busy building her version of the truth. And I remember thinking, this is it, this is the moment where betrayal thinks it has already won, where it gets loud and careless and starts celebrating too early. And I took a breath, steady, controlled, the kind of breath that doesn't come from panic but from certainty, because the truth was, this night didn't belong to her, it never did, she just didn't know it yet, and as I leaned against the doorway watching them move around my house like it was theirs, I realized something that made everything strangely calm. Betrayal only feels powerful when it thinks it's hidden, but the second it steps into the light, the second it believes it's untouchable, that's when karma starts moving, quiet, patient. Already inside the room, and neither of them had any idea how far this had already gone. Ryan stepped further inside like he belonged there, glancing around at the photos on the wall, the ones Emily used to dust every Sunday morning back when she still pretended this house meant something, and he nodded like he was approving it, like he was measuring a life he had no part in building, while Emily poured him a drink from the cabinet I installed with my own hands 5 years ago during a weekend she said she was proud of me for, and now she stood there smiling at him like that version of us never existed, like it had been quietly erased and replaced with this new story where I was nothing more than background noise. And I watched the way she moved, the way she laughed just a little louder than normal, just enough to make a point, and I realized this was not impulsive, this was not a mistake, this was something she had been rehearsing in her head long before tonight, every word, every glance, every calculated step deeper into disrespect. And what struck me the most was not anger, it was clarity, the kind that settles in when all the pieces finally line up and the truth stops hiding behind excuses, because weeks ago I had already seen the messages, the late-night conversations that started harmless and slowly turned into something else, something quieter but heavier, something that carried intention and planning, and I remembered the exact moment it shifted, the exact sentence that told me everything I needed to know, and from that point on I stopped reacting, I stopped questioning, I started preparing, because when betrayal becomes this deliberate, this comfortable, it stops being a secret and starts becoming a pattern, and patterns are predictable, and predictable things can be controlled. And as Emily handed him that glass and leaned just a little too close like she was testing how far she could push it, I realized she thought this was the peak of her control, she thought this was the moment she had already won, but what she did not understand was that every step she took tonight was walking straight into something I had already set in motion long before she ever opened that door. I remember the exact moment everything became undeniable. It was not some dramatic confrontation or a loud argument, it was quiet, almost forgettable, the kind of moment most people would ignore, but I could not unsee it. I had come home early 3 weeks ago, about 4:30 in the afternoon, the sun still high, casting long shadows across the driveway, and her car was there, which was normal, but what was not normal was the way she did not hear me come in. No music, no television, just silence, thick and unnatural, like The house itself was holding its breath, and as I stepped inside I heard her voice, low and different, softer than the way she ever spoke to me, and I stopped, not because I wanted to spy but because something in my chest told me to listen. And then I heard his name, Ryan, spoken like it belonged in this house, like it had been there longer than I realized, and I did not burst and I did not demand answers. I stood there in that quiet hallway and let the truth reveal itself piece by piece, because once you hear it you cannot unhear it. And what she said next was not emotional, it was not confused, it was planned. She talked about timing, about when I would be gone, about how easy it was to keep things separate, like our life together was just a schedule to work around. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean break, like a switch flipping from reaction to observation, because anger would have made me predictable, and predictable men lose, and I was done losing without even knowing the game had started. So instead I walked back out the same door I came in, got into my truck, and sat there for a full 5 minutes, letting the engine idle, while everything settled into place. And from that day forward I stopped being part of the story she thought she was writing and started building one she could not see. I called a lawyer the next morning, not in a rush, not in panic, just calm, methodical, and I asked questions about ownership, about accounts, about what happens when trust is broken, not emotionally but legally. And every answer became another piece of something bigger, something structured, something that would not rely on shouting or confrontation but on timing and proof and patience. I moved quietly after that. I adjusted things she never noticed, small details that would not matter until they mattered completely. Accounts shifted, documents updated, access changed, all of it done slowly, carefully, like laying down tracks for a train no one could hear coming. And the cameras, those were the final piece, not because I needed to catch her but because I needed everything undeniable, recorded, clean, factual, something that would not argue back or change its story. And as I stood there now watching her laugh in my living room with a man she thought I would never see, I realized she believed this was the first move. She believed tonight was the beginning, but for me this was already the end, the moment where everything she'd built on secrets stepped directly into the light. And once that happens there is no controlling what comes next. Emily leaned against the kitchen counter like nothing in the world had shifted, like this was just another comfortable night inside a life she believed she controlled completely. And Ryan followed her lead, setting his glass down, slowly glancing around again, but this time with a hint of curiosity, like he was starting to notice something he could not quite name, the kind of feeling you get when a room is just a little too quiet, a little too still. And I saw it in his eyes before she did, that small flicker of hesitation, the instinct that tells you something is off but you cannot explain why. And that was the difference between them. She was deep inside the illusion she built, but he was still outside enough to feel the edges of it. And I stepped forward just enough for my presence to register, not dramatic, not loud, just enough for the shift to begin. And Emily turned her head slightly, her expression still relaxed, still confident, like she expected me to play the same role I always had, the quiet one, the one who absorbs and adapts. And she gave me that same dismissive look, the one that said stay out of this, without needing words. And for a second the room held that version of me, the one she believed in, the one who would step back and disappear. But then her phone buzzed once, sharp and out of place on the counter, and she glanced at it casually, at first the way you do when you think you already know what it is, and then her expression paused, not fully changed, not yet, but just enough to crack the surface, because whatever she saw did not fit into the story she thought she was controlling. And I watched that moment carefully, the exact second where confidence starts to hesitate, where certainty begins to question itself, and I realized this was where everything turns, not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with confusion, the kind that spreads quietly through the mind when reality does not match expectation. And Ryan noticed it too, his posture shifting slightly, his attention moving from her to the phone, to me, like he was trying to understand a situation he suddenly was not in control of. And Emily picked up the phone slowly, her movements just a fraction less certain than before, and that was when the silence in the room stopped feeling comfortable and started feeling heavy, like something unseen had just stepped into it. And neither of them knew how to respond. Her eyes moved across the screen once, then again, slower this time, like her brain needed a second pass to accept what it was seeing. And I could tell the exact second it landed, not because she said anything but because her shoulders tightened just slightly, the kind of tension you only notice when you are looking for it. And the room shifted again, not physically but in weight, like something invisible had just pressed down on everything at once. And Ryan leaned in a little, trying to read her expression, trying to catch up to whatever had just changed, but she angled the phone away instinctively, like she suddenly needed control again, like she needed to protect whatever version of reality she still thought she had left, and that was when I spoke, not loud, not sharp, just steady enough to cut through the silence. I said, "Go ahead." Emily read it out loud, and for the first time that night she did not have an immediate response, no quick remark, no dismissive smile, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have, and that pause told me more than anything else could, because confidence does not hesitate unless it is already slipping. And she looked up at me. Then really looked this time, like she was trying to understand something she had completely overlooked, and I could see the question forming behind her eyes, the one she was not ready to ask yet, the one that meant she was starting to realize this was not random, this was not bad timing, this was something else entirely. And her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, not weak, just uncertain, as she said, "What is this, Daniel?" And I almost smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because that was the moment. Everything aligned the moment the story she believed in began to fracture. And I answered simply, "It is the part you never thought to look for." And Ryan shifted beside her, now fully aware that whatever he stepped into was not what he expected, his earlier confidence fading into something cautious, something unsure, as he glanced between us, trying to understand the rules of a situation that had just changed without warning, and I could feel it clearly now, the shift in power, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like a line had been crossed, and there was no stepping back from it. She held the phone like it had suddenly gained weight, like the few lines on that screen carried more force than anything said in this room, and I watched her eyes move again, slower, now more deliberate, like she was trying to find a different meaning, a different outcome, something that would let her stay in control. But there was no alternate version of what she was reading, no softer interpretation, no way to reshape it into something harmless. And Ryan stepped back just half an inch, not enough to be obvious, but enough to show instinct had taken over, the kind that tells you when you are standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I let the silence sit there long enough for it to do its work before I spoke again, calm, steady, unchanged. I said, "Every account connected to this house was transferred this morning, every shared access removed, every financial link severed, clean and documented, and this property, the one you are standing in right now, was placed under a structure you never asked about, never noticed, because you never thought you had to." And her head lifted slowly, eyes narrowing, not in anger yet, but in confusion, trying to connect pieces she did not know existed, trying to understand how something so fundamental could shift without her seeing it happen. And that was the truth. She had not been looking, not for me, not for what I was doing, not for anything that did not fit the version of me she decided to believe in. And I continued, not to overwhelm, not to explain everything, just enough to let reality settle. And I said, "You thought this was your space to control, your decisions to make without consequence, but everything you see here has already been separated from you legally, permanently." And Ryan let out a quiet breath, not a reaction, just recognition, the kind that comes when you realize you have stepped into something far more serious than you expected. And Emily finally spoke again, but her voice was different now, less certain, more measured, as she said, "You are bluffing." And I met her gaze without raising my voice, without shifting my stance, and answered simply, "No, I just stopped reacting and started preparing." The word bluff hung in the air for a second, like she expected it to land and reset. Everything like this would snap back into a version she could still control, but it did not move me, and that was what unsettled her the most. Not what I said, but what I did not do. No anger, no raised voice, no attempt to convince her, just certainty. And she shifted her weight slightly, her grip tightening around the phone, as if holding onto it could anchor her back into the version of reality she preferred. And then it happened again, another notification, sharp and immediate, and this time she did not hesitate to look, and whatever she saw removed the last piece of confidence she had been holding onto, because her expression changed fully now, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet collapse of certainty. And I knew exactly what she was reading, the confirmation from the attorney, the formal notice that had already been filed, the documentation that made everything I said real in a way she could not argue with. And Ryan stepped back further this time, no longer subtle, no longer trying to hide the instinct to distance himself from something that was clearly no longer in his favor, his earlier posture gone, replaced with caution, the kind that comes when you realize you are not part of the plan you thought you were stepping into. And Emily looked at me again, but this time there was no dismissal, no confidence, just a question she did not know how to form, because asking it would mean admitting she had lost control long before this moment. And I took a step closer, not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to close the space, and I said quietly, "This is what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. And the room went still, not because of the words but because of what they confirmed, that everything she thought she understood about me, about this house, about her position in it had been wrong, and for the first time that night she was no longer leading anything, she was reacting, trying to catch up to something that had already passed her, and I could see it clearly now, the exact point where the story she built stopped being hers and started becoming something she could not rewrite. Emily's lips parted like she was about to say something, to push back, to regain control, to pull this back into something she could still manage, but nothing came out because there was nothing left to argue with. The kind of silence that follows when every exit you thought existed quietly disappears, and she looked around the room like she was seeing it for the first time, not as hers, not as something she could command, but as something she had already lost without realizing it. And Ryan shifted again, this time fully stepping away from her side, not dramatically, not with confrontation, just distance, the kind that says I am no longer part of this, and he ran a hand across the back of his neck, glancing toward the door. Like he was calculating how quickly he could leave without making things worse, and that small movement said everything, because the moment pressure appeared he chose himself, not her. And I saw it register in her eyes, that realization sharper than anything I could have said, that the person she had been aligning with, the one she thought gave her power, was already disconnecting the second things stopped being easy. And I let that moment sit long enough for it to settle before I spoke again, calm, even measured. I said, you built this on a version of me that no longer exists. And she shook her head slightly, like she was trying to reject it, trying to hold on to something familiar, but even that felt weaker now, like she was arguing against reality itself. And her voice, when it came, was softer, uncertain, asking a question she did not want the answer to. She said, how long? And I answered without hesitation, long enough to understand everything. And that was the final shift, not loud, not explosive, just complete, because in that moment she knew this was not reaction, this was not sudden, this was something that had been unfolding quietly while she believed she was in control. And the weight of that realization settled over the room, heavier than anything else, because there is no defense against something that was already finished. Before you realized it began. Ryan did not wait for another word. He glanced once toward Emily, then toward me, and made a quiet decision, the kind people make when they realize staying costs more than leaving, and without drama, without explanation, he stepped toward the door, his earlier confidence gone, completely replaced by distance and self-preservation. And Emily turned toward him instinctively, like she expected him to say something, to defend the situation, to stand beside her, but he did not. He just gave a short nod, not agreement, not support, just acknowledgement of a situation he no longer wanted to be part of, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him. Softer than it should have been, and the sound of it settling into the frame felt final in a way that did not need to be explained. And Emily stood there alone now, in a space that no longer responded to her the way it used to, and I watched as she tried to find something to hold on to, some version of control, some argument, some explanation, but everything she had built depended on the assumption that I was unaware, and that assumption no longer existed. And I took one step back, giving her space, not out of kindness but because there was nothing left to confront. And I said quietly, this is where it ends, not with anger, not with noise, just with truth. And she looked at me like she was seeing a different person entirely. Like the version of me she had reduced and dismissed had been replaced by something she could not read. And for a moment neither of us moved, because the weight of it had already settled. And then I turned, walked past the same walls that once held our life together, and reached for the door. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized something simple and clear. Betrayal always believes it is ahead, but it never sees how close karma already is. And by the time it does, it is already too late.